most of you that are here, I think, know about me and my work. Majority of you, I know a lot of you keep coming up to me and talking to me, so I think a lot of you do know my work. But I'm going to have to go back over some of it because before we get into the Nostradamus. I haven't lectured on the Nostradamus for quite a while because I've gone into other things. I've gone into the convoluted universe, you know, the shifting of the earth and the raising of the consciousness into the new earth. That's been my main focus. So I've gotten away from the Nostradamus material. And we were thinking about it. We said, you know, there's a lot of people that probably haven't even heard that about those books and the lectures I did on that. So we said, okay, I'll do that for this one and kind of review all of that. But some of you have probably read the books because they've been out for 20 years. That's a long time, and there's hundreds of thousands of copies have been sold all over the world, and they're in 20 different languages. So they've been covering a lot of territory. So the majority of you have probably already read them, but then other people said they don't even know who Nostradamus is. But the first thing I want to do, though, is go into a little of my background. You know, people are always asking me, how did you get started in all of this? I said, that's a long story. And I usually tell them it was in the first book that I ever wrote was the story of how it all happened. The first book I ever wrote was called 5 Lives Remembered. That book has never been published. And the reason why was because it was before its time. And it was a story of how I started out 40 years ago in the 1960s. And it was me and my husband, and we were in the very beginning of hypnosis. That's why when I give my classes and everything, I tell people, I've been at this for 40 years. I know every phase of hypnosis there is because I've done it. But I've seen how it can be, how it has changed and how everything has evolved. And that's how I developed my own technique, because I saw what was not needed and I was going to try something new. And that's how I have gotten to what I'm doing now, is by trying and experimenting. But back 40 years ago was my husband and I were working on this. And he had just come back from Vietnam. And we were stationed down in Texas on a Navy base. He was 21 years in the Navy. So we were stationed down there, and in those days it was all stop smoking, lose weight. That's the only thing hypnosis was used for. You would never have done anything like what I do now. It was unheard of. The only book out at that time dealing with this was The Search for Bridie Murphy. You remember that? That's a book today that wouldn't even be published. It's too simple, too ordinary. I get hundreds and hundreds of those sessions all the time, and I put them in a box. They would never get published because they were too ordinary. That was a book before its time. It started people thinking about reincarnation and past lives, but it was the first one. It was all that was out. There were no books out to tell a hypnotist how to conduct a session like that, because it just didn't happen. And all we were involved with was just the habits. Well, on the Navy base that we were stationed on, there was a doctor there. He asked my husband and I if we would help this one patient. She was very obese and having kidney problems from overeating. He called it nervous eating. He said, can you at least do the hypnosis on her just to get her to relax? That's all he thought. Maybe that would help, just to get her to relax. And the reason I'm telling all of this is because, maybe I should better tell that first. This book is now going to be published. It's a long time coming. It was supposed to be here for the conference, but it's still at the printers. And we do have order blanks for it. But we feel it's time. I just thought it was too old-fashioned, passé. But people are always saying, how did you get started? Well, anyway, we were working with the woman just to get her to relax, not knowing anything had happened. And she suddenly goes into a past life where she's in the 1920s and in the roaring 20s in Chicago with the gangsters. And it's like, what's going on here? Because, this had never happened before. We'd never read about anything like this happening. Didn't know it was even possible. So it's a story of how, not knowing what we were doing, and we was using the portable tape recorder of the day, reel to reel, those big ones, you remember that? It was portable. I got it out the other day to get a picture of it for the book, and you can hardly lift it. It's the portable ones of the day. That's what we were recording things on. But not knowing what we were doing and what was right, what was wrong, because there were no rules out there. But we had such a curiosity. That's always been my trademark in my work, is my curiosity. I always wanted to know more and know things. Otherwise, we might have got scared, just said, well, I don't know what this is, but it doesn't make any sense. So anyway, she went back into the lifetime where she was in the roaring 20s. And so we thought it was interesting, so we kept working with that. And incidentally, along the way, her blood pressure dropped, she began losing weight, her kidneys did come back to normal. But that was a kind of a byproduct then. But as we began doing this, we did it every week, she began going back through one lifetime after another. No guidelines, nothing to tell us what to do. We just kept asking questions. So she went back through 5 different lifetimes to when she was created by God. And that's why we called the book 5 Lives Remembered. And we just thought it was fascinating. And the people on the base knew what we were doing, and they'd come over to the house to listen to the latest chapter. And we didn't tell anyone who the woman was. We were trying to protect her identity, because on a Navy base, it's like a small town. And we didn't let anyone know who she was, but they were so exciting because nobody was thinking like this. You got to remember the words reincarnation, New Age, hypnosis, past life regression, those words hadn't even been coined yet. They were not even invented. We were way ahead of our times. The only ones who would have been into that would have been religious people. But nobody at that time knew anything about it. There were no New Age stores. They hadn't even come along. There were no books on reincarnation, no books on past life regression. So it's what I mean. This was totally new, and the people who came to hear it, it was blowing everybody away. They had to start changing their belief system and making them think in a new direction. But this is amazing. Now I know she was a somnambulist. And that's where I work now, in the somnambulistic level. The somnambulistic level is the deepest possible level of trance. When they go into that level, they don't remember anything. They become the other personality totally. And I love working like that, because to me it's time travel. You go back into a past life and they become the other person. They don't remember anything dealing with this life at all. You were to bring up something that occurred in this life, they don't even know what you're talking about. And if you read my Jesus books, you know what I mean. I call it time travel, and to me it is so exciting to be able to do that. But can you imagine the first time it ever happens to you, out of the blue? She's a somnambulist, and here she's this sexy flapper in the 1920s. And we're sitting there, what's going on here? And then one of her lives, she was in the Civil War, a Southern belle on a plantation. I mean, this was all very exciting. So people would come over and they'd listen to this. And we spent months working on this. And we started experimenting. Well, we can do this. What else can we do? Then we even went into the future just to see what we were going to be doing. Your curiosity is out there, why not? And we even started exploring events. And one of them, we had her go to the Kennedy assassination, which in those days it only happened a few years before, and tell us what was happening at that time. She saw everything that happened, and she reported it being he was killed with a crossfire. And here we're sitting there, what? Because that was not what the Warren Commission had said at that time, with the conclusions they'd come to. So we were experimenting and doing all kinds of things nobody had ever heard of. And then it was just like, well, what can we do next? Because it was so exciting. Now the book is all about all of these things we went through. The amazing thing is, everything we found in that life has not been discredited now. We had walk-ins before the term was even formed. You know, Ruth Montgomery didn't come up with the term walk-ins until the 1970s. In that fooling around and experiment, we had walk-ins. So if you imagine what this is like if you've never heard of it before. So anyhow, this went on for several months, and it was exciting. Then it all came to an abrupt, crashing, terrorizing halt, because my husband was on his way to the base one night and he was almost killed. He was hit by a drunk driver, and he had a Volkswagen bus and nothing in front of you, a head-on collision on the way to the base, and he was ground into the metal. His body was completely crushed. And the doctors, at that time, they had the helicopters there. They didn't have the jaws of life. They were going to amputate his legs to get him out of the car. It was a really horrible experience. And they got him out. The only way his life was saved was because the car in back of him, there was a corpsman that had just returned from Vietnam. And he knew how to handle trauma, and he was able to get to him. But he lost all the blood in his body. His body was completely crushed. His face was torn apart. I mean, when they got there with the helicopter and finally hooked the fire truck to one end of the car and the other car to the other to pry it apart to get him out. And when they got him in the helicopter, he'd lost all the blood in his body. And they said, there's no way this man can live. And even his heart stopped 3 times during all of this. And they said, if he does live, he's going to be a vegetable. So you can imagine what this was on me. But I know when I got to the hospital that night, and the doctors were all coming in telling me, 5 doctors, one after the other, saying there's no way this man can live. It's too much trauma, too much damage. And I kept telling them, no, you don't know. Because when we were doing that experimenting, we had her see the future. And she saw us living where we are now, in the country out here in Arkansas. She didn't say Arkansas, she saw it was in the country. Saw us with grandchildren. And my oldest daughter was only 15 at that time. And it was like she saw us in the future. And I believed that because this was so fascinating, I knew it had to be true. So when the doctors were coming in and telling me he couldn't possibly live during the night, I said, no, he is. I couldn't tell them how I knew, but I knew they were wrong. And finally they said, well, if you're that sure about it, maybe he'll have a chance. So during the time he was in and out of consciousness, in and out of a coma for a long time, and all kinds of miracles began happening. His face went back together without any plastic surgery. They began calling him the Miracle Man. All kinds of things happened that could not possibly have happened. They didn't have to amputate. They put him in a body cast, and he was in that body cast for 8 months. He spent a year in the hospital. But when they saw he was finally going to live, and they were just completely astounded, they said then they better start putting him back together. So anyway, during all of this was going on, the people on the base began saying, this is your punishment. Fooling around with something you're not supposed to be fooling around with. Reincarnation, for goodness sakes. You know, you're not supposed to do those things. You're asking questions. You're peeking around hidden corners, opening up hidden doors. And they were all saying, this is your punishment for doing those things. I couldn't believe that. Because when we were taking her back through the 5 lives, she went back to where she was created by God. And we found a God that was so loving, I knew he couldn't punish somebody for asking questions and wanting to know more. So I knew that couldn't be the truth. But we went through a very bad time there anyway, and he spent a year in the hospital, and when he was finally put out, we moved up here to Arkansas, and he spent 25 years in a wheelchair. But he made his life from his own. He went into a black depression because his life was over, and we had a very hard time. But the book tells the story of how all of this happened. And I wrote the book, 35 years ago, right after all the incidents and what happened. And I tried to get it published. It was ahead of its time. Nobody knew anything about reincarnation. They didn't know about past lives. So I went through years of having the rejection come back. I said, I know what it's like to be an author. I've had absolutely every disappointment and heartbreak that can happen to an author has happened to me. I've been there, done that. So as all of these things kept coming back, I finally gave up. I said, well, it's not going to be published. There was no New Age bookstores. I think the bookstores had one little shelf for anything metaphysical. That's how far ahead we were of our time. So I said, all right, I'll just put it aside. That didn't mean I stopped writing, because when we moved to Arkansas, after the kids began growing up, they began going up to get married and going to college, it was like, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? I wanted to get back into that because that was so fascinating, to be able to go in time and relive all of these things that were happening. So I knew there had to be other ways of doing the hypnosis, because in the ways we were doing it in those days, it was the old-fashioned way. Watch the shiny object and all of that, you know, and the testing and the long drawn-out inductions. And I knew there had to be easier ways. So I began to study the other methods, and then I found that the new methods were done with visualization and imagery. So that was what I began doing, and I wanted to do the past life regressions. And people were coming to me here in the hills of Arkansas. Over at Huntsville, there's only 2,000 people. But they were coming, and I began doing the past lives. And immediately, I was having somnambulists, which are the deepest trance subjects. They became the other people. The first ones that came to me were the Jesus material. Now, the odds on this stuff is happening is really very slim. But that's why I said I didn't stop writing. I put the other book aside. I began doing this kind of research, gathering material, and I started writing other books. The other books have all been printed over the years. The Jesus material, the Nostradamus material, all my books on UFOs, on life after death. I've got 15 books out now that I've done. And every time I get a lecture, they say, well, why don't you print that book about how it started? I said, oh, it's too old now. It's too passé. I've come so far. I've done so much since then that it doesn't seem right to come out with it now. So I kept putting it off. Well, it was only, she kept telling me, my daughter kept saying, you know, you really need to publish that book. And I said, oh, I don't know. It's too old now. So it was a few months ago, I'm doing some remodeling in my house, and I was in my office, and I started cleaning out all these old filing cabinets. There I came across the original manuscript, and I'm holding it there, and it's like it's talking to me, saying, I think it's time. So after 40 years, so I gave it to my daughter, and I said, here, you read it. You tell me what you think. Is it passé, you know, is it too old? Because I have come a long way since then. You know, the metaphysical stuff I'm into now, I'm learning more and more and more stuff. So she went and read it, and she cried most of the way through it. But She told me, she said, Mom, this book has to be published. You said it's a bridge book, didn't you? That, will you tell them what you said? Okay. Okay, go ahead. So, well, she said it was a bridge book because there are a lot of people out there now who don't know the basics. That's one thing. But also, it's to show how far you can come. She was thinking it needed to be required reading in my classes now to show what you can do and not even having a clue what you were doing and what you could accomplish with it. And it's like a time capsule, also, she said, because it is the 60s and the way things were in those days, the belief system, all of it. Well, anyway, she said it's got to come out. So then I took it and read it, and I said, well, you know, it is a good book. And there are people out there who were just beginning and just starting these things. So the only thing I had to do was write an introduction explaining why it was so long coming. And then we sent it to the printers. And we were hoping to have it here in time for this. But it'll be a few days before it gets out. Okay. Monday we'll be out of here by that time. Anyway, we do have order blanks on it, and some people say they want everything I've written anyway. And this is the beginning of how I started out on this long, long journey that's taken me 40 years to get to this point. So if anybody's interested, we do have the order blanks, and we'll fill them as soon as the book gets here. But it's 5 Lives Remembered. So then I won't have any excuses anymore then, but you know, I'm still writing more books. There's still more coming. But anyway, it shows nothing is ever easy. You know, if you start on a path, you better make sure that's what you want to do. That's why I didn't find my first publisher for 9 years. It took me 9 years to find the first publisher. I call that my testing time. They were testing me. Like, okay, you can back out if you want. You got a chance, you can back out. Once you're committed, there's no backing out. And that's what it was like until finally I said, okay, I'm going to do this. I want to do this. And the minute I made that commitment, everything began to happen. And I found my first publisher right after that. I just sat one night, I said, okay, it's yours. You do whatever you want to do with it. I'm tired of sending it out and having it come back and rejections. But the minute I made that commitment and said, I'm going to do this, then everything began happening. So there's no way out now. But the first books came out in 1989. The first ones to be published were the Nostradamus material. They weren't the first ones I wrote, but they were the first ones to come out. So I'm going to tell you about the Nostradamus material anyway. Because by that time, I had already written the Jesus books. I think I'd written Keepers of the Garden and Between Death and Life. And then I got involved in the Nostradamus material at the same time that I became a UFO investigator. Because I've been doing that for 20 years, working on UFO cases and ETs. So now I'm into all of it. I ended up writing 4 books about the UFOs. But the Nostradamus material happened at the same time I was working on the beginning of the UFO investigations. Well, by this time, I don't think anything could surprise me. We had all these years of working on this. But the Nostradamus material was very strange. I didn't go looking for it. I don't think anybody could. But I had a woman, just wanted to go into some past lives. She didn't really know anything about metaphysics. I call her an ordinary woman because she had 10 children. One of them was deaf and mute, and she had never finished high school. She dropped out of high school to take care of this large family. She had 2 jobs. So it's not the kind of person you would think had time to sit down and say, well, let's think of a hoax to fool the world. And that's what I have been accused of. I've been accused of everything you can think of. But they say, oh, you're a really good fiction writer. I couldn't begin to make up these things I write about. But this was a woman who had no idea what was going on. I had a past life with her. She goes back to a past life where she was a student of Nostradamus in the 1500s in France. She didn't even know later who Nostradamus was. She couldn't even pronounce his name. I knew who he was, but I'd never studied the prophecies. Now they're saying I'm the world's foremost expert on the Nostradamus prophecies. But when I started out, I didn't know anything more than anybody in this room. But, you know, you probably know who he is. Sometimes I get people who don't know who he is. He was the most famous psychic that ever lived, and he lived in the 1500s in France, and he wrote almost 1,000 quatrains. And the quatrains are 4-line poems, but that also they're 4-line puzzles in the case of Nostradamus. A prophecy or a puzzle, and he wrote them in the most amazing language. People have been studying them for over 400 years trying to figure out what they mean.